What's going on, everyone? So we are here, and well, I totally lied to you all yesterday. I mentioned that I would have a Mace, or not a Mace Windu video, but a deck video from one of the Playtester qualifier decks that was a little bit surprising. But we got a bunch of spoilers today, and a lot of sweet ones. It looks like we are in the height of spoiler season, as I had initially thought at the beginning of this week. And so they're changing it up a little bit because today is Wednesday and we got a leader on Monday. So maybe they're doing a Monday, Wednesday type deal where they're going to do leader reveals then instead of Tuesday, Thursday, which they were doing previously. I'm not sure. But anyways, we got a new leader, a lot of ships to talk about and a lot of cool stuff. So let's dive into it with a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. And a special call out to my good friend Paladin out there who I absolutely hate. And you'll know who you are. For beating me in my Carabas matches. But I had to put him on this list. Don't worry, your honor. And also I have a TCG player link in the description down below for you all to pick up any of these cards. But let's talk about the first one, the brand new leader in Admiral Pet. And my goodness, am I exceptionally excited about this guy. So this is a brand new villainy command leader. He has a cool action to play a capital ship unit from your hand, and it will cost one less. That's pretty interesting. You basically get a guaranteed discount on some of the most expensive and powerful cards in the game. Generally speaking, none of the cards that have the capital ship tag are cheap. Basically none of them. The only exception, I believe, is Outlaw Corona, because that is technically a capital ship, and that allows you to play a Outlaw Corona, which is a 3/5 space unit for 2 resources, but it has a pretty devastating bounty, which may not even make it worthwhile to play for 2 resources. Outside of that, we're looking at like 5 resources or above, so this is definitely a more later game action to be using. Although you can absolutely be playing some of those 5-6 resource plays potentially a turn earlier. On the flip side, we have a 5 to deploy, 2/7, no piloting, Imperial Official, with each capital ship unit you play costing 2 less, which is crazy because of the potential of playing something like a Tarkin Yellow space deck, but with Piet. Because if I were just to go ahead and pull up all of the capital ships here, which I have, let me just go ahead and pull up that card list. We've got a bunch of new ones, which we'll skip past, but things like a Devastator, for example. If our good friend Piet is flipped, by the way, you can't use that front action into the back side to go ahead and make it cost 3 less, because this requires you to play a capital ship, so you can't just like use the action and then go ahead and flip over with Piet. That does not work as you would hope. But we're flipping Piet. It's an 8 cost Devastator. Remember, Triple Dark Raid allows you to play any sort of vehicle from the top cards of your deck, and you get to pay a 5 cost resource reduction on it. That means that we have an 8 cost Devastator base. We have the 3 cost Triple Dark Raid. It'll shave 5 off of our Devastator, which puts it down to 3, which means we now have a 6 cost Devastator when we have the resources. That is absolutely insane. Assuming Piet's on the battlefield. You know, the turn prior, you might have been able to play a different capital ship, something that costs 7 maybe, but we can get a Devastator down on turn 5, readied up to kill something and attack for 10 with Overwhelm. That is crazy. That is absolutely crazy. Not to mention it has Sentinel, so if you are struggling, like you play this, or play Triple Dark Raid, hopefully you grab a Devastator, kill one of their ground units, which you most likely will have about that 6 resources. And then you get to go ahead and have Sentinel for any space attacks your opponent has. And then maybe you just go ahead and overwhelm through one of their spaces or just dome them for 10. Absolutely possible. But that's not just the limitations of this. Things like Gladiator Star Destroyer suddenly look a lot better because this is now a 4 cost 5/6 Sentinel for that turn. We have things like our Quinton's Assault Cruiser, which is a 6 cost 7/8 ambusher to potentially give you a resource. Relentless is a 7 resource capital ship. Ruthless Raider, which looks absolutely insane as a capital ship. This is a 5-cost Ruthless Raider on the front side, or a 4-cost Ruthless Raider with Piet, which is absolutely crazy. If you go the aggression route, obviously Chimera. If you're going to go that triple dark raid, you're going to have a 6-cost 8/7 Chimera. Lots of potential here. As I mentioned, the Outlaw Corona, this is now a 2-cost 3/5. Is that good enough? I'm not sure. A couple of new ships that we'll talk about in just a moment in this video, but really, it's the Devastator, it's the Relentlesses, and Ruthless Raider. This is the card that looks exceptionally powerful with this deck. Obviously, Ruthless Raider is a card that you really talk about already. On the other hand, do you want to go the more rampy, I could play like Villainy, Vigilance, and Command, and maybe go like blue-green ramping into Avenger for 7 resources? Like flip Piet. Around the turn, you can get Avenger down. You'll probably have ramped already 1 more than your opponent. So your opponent's on 6 resources, you're on 7. Hopefully you don't have a way to kill Piet. You flip him, you play Avenger, and suddenly you got a 7-resource Avenger. That comes down exceptionally early. Not to mention, if you want to play the Assault Cruiser with the Avenger, you can get down Piet even earlier, potentially even ramp more than you think. Like, there's just so many different potential options with this card. And mind you, as I said, we have a bunch of new capital ships that we're going to talk about today. So who knows if there's going to be way more capital ships to synergize with Piet. This looks really fun. It looks really, really fun. And I cannot wait to start playing with Piet here. I think he's going to do some massive, massive fun things. Is it going to be strong? Is it going to be like the most competitive deck? I'm not sure about that unless we get some more cheap capital ships. The only payoff of Piet being, okay, I can play my late game bombs 2 resources cheaper, or guaranteed 1 resource cheaper with the action from Piet. I don't know if that's necessarily good enough. If we have way more capital ships where we can actually curve out with capital ships, like we have a lot more 5-cost, 6-cost, 7-cost, to where like as early as turn 3, we can pay 4 for a 5-cost capital ship. And then on turn 3 or turn 4, we play a 5-cost capital ship. That or a 6-cost capital ship for 5 resources, that could get a little bit crazy, as we've seen with like New Han Blue, right? Just playing cards for 1 resource cheaper is insane. It is insane. Next up, though, we've got one of those capital ships that I mentioned. It's a new 6-cost space unit in Villainy. It's a 5/7 Imperial Vehicle capital ship. On attack, you create a TIE Fighter token. So this one, 5/7 for 6 resources, doesn't really have any entry the battlefield abilities or anything like that, or when played abilities, nothing like that. Play it in Piet. It's a 5/7 for 5. It's not like particularly insane. It is definitely decent on 5 resources. At 6 resources, the 5/7 stat line, well, it doesn't necessarily trade well because Ruthless Raider and Fet's Fire Spray, things like that, are 6 power. So that extra power really does matter at that point in the curve. And then the creating TIE Fighter tokens, it's a 1/1 in space. Like, it doesn't even have relevant tags all that much. I'm not a huge fan of this card. This looks like more just like a draft card. It can potentially have some legs where we're playing like ATSTs right now in some of the decks. If you're playing Triple Dark Raid, you could maybe transition over to the Quasar TIE Carrier because you're only missing out on 1 point of damage. You lose Overwhelm, but you're going to be left behind with a TIE Fighter, and it is a space unit, so maybe you can commit more to space, which I could see since it also is an Imperial unit. Maybe that's worthwhile. This looks more of like a draft card. I don't really see this being like exceptionally strong, but I could be wrong. And next up, we got Resupply Carrier. This is a 6-cost space unit in just Command, and we have a 4/5 vehicle Imperial capital ship. When played, you may put the top card of your deck into play as a resource. So kind of our first ramp card that immediately ramps you when you play it. Don't have to wait for it to die like Super Laser Technician. It's not an event like Resupply, or you don't have to wait for your unit to die and then play Spark of Hope. It is just comes into play as a 4/5 and then gives you a resource, immediate ramp, immediate unit on a 6-cost body. I'm not sure about this, to be honest. This seems way, way more of like, okay, I'm trying to get to my 8 and 9 resource plays. Things like, oh, I want to play my Reinforcement Walkers, my Emperor Palpatines, my Devastators, like that type of deck. So maybe you could see some viability with Resupply Carrier. I think it's a little bit too late on the cost for most mid-range decks to play this. You really need to take advantage of like 8, 9, 10 resources. And it's hard for most decks to do that. So I'm not really sure about that. And also, it is a 4/5. We mentioned about the TIE Carrier, that a 5/7, well, it is decent. stats, it's not going to one-shot some of the bigger units that we're going to see in the space arena. Both these seem more like, well, options for draft. And honestly, resupply carrier doesn't even seem like that amazing of an option for draft, because you will run into find yourself decking yourself in draft a lot more often. So seems interesting. Maybe we could do something. Maybe if you go like full on ramp, and there was talk from some articles early on that there's going to be a unit that's going to be the biggest unit that we've seen yet. Maybe it's going to cost some amazing things, or maybe we can make Endless Legions work one time, maybe. Next up, we've got Fleet Interdictor. It's a 7-cost space unit in Vigilance Villainy. It's a 6/6 Imperial Vehicle Capital Ship. It has Sentinel, and when defeated, you may defeat a space unit that costs 3 or less. So, obviously, earlier, Piet, Capital Ship, playing the Fleet Interdictor for 5 resources is kind of nuts, because you get a 5-resource 6/6 Sentinel in space, and then you can even have this extra trigger when it dies. A 5-resource 6/6 Sentinel in space is massive, and definitely an above rate card, and can completely stop any space aggression. This card with Piet might just be good enough, right? Like, this might just make Piet good enough. If there are a bunch of space-based decks in set 4, which it seems like it's leaning that direction, right? Any sort of massive space body that you can get down that early is going to be really tough to deal with. So I'm actually curious about this card. I think it does have some options. For 6 resources in like Piet, it's a 6/6. Not too bad. It does have Sentinel. For 7 resources, it's a little bit later for Sentinels, right? We've seen like Obi-Wans be good. We've seen like Bendu's and that type of effect be decent. But it's usually because they have a nice when defeated trigger, and they come down a turn earlier. This one has a decent when defeated trigger. You're probably not going to get value from it every time, but if this card has use in the game as a Sentinel, then it's going to probably have use as a when defeated trigger as well, because they're going to have space units that you want to defend against. And remember, it's any space unit that costs 3 or less, so even like the tokens and such could potentially be a target, which is nice. But overall, I don't really see this card being like an exceptionally good card outside of things like Piet and being able to cheat on its cost. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe space is just going to be so dominant that Sentinels in space are going to be so important. And then Fleet Interdictor becomes one of the most important cards. I don't think so, though. Next up, we've got Cassian Andor, which is a new pilot, as well as a new 3-cost ground unit in Vigilance Heroism. It's a 3/4. It's a pretty meh stat line, but it has piloting for 2 Vigilance and Heroism. And it has attached unit on attack gains on attack, discard a card from the defending player's deck. If that card costs 3 or less, you get to draw a card, and it gives you +1/+3 in terms of stats. It is a rebel. It is a pilot. This on attack trigger is interesting. I actually really like this. We've seen effects that deploy to the board, whether it's getting stats or just being units of themselves. Getting the ability to draw additional cards can be nice, especially when you're talking about a deck that has piloting. Piloting seems to be leaning a little bit cheaper, and if you're getting 2 for 1, you're going to want some of those extra cards. So I think that could be interesting. +1/+3 stat line is kind of obnoxious. +3 toughness is a lot, especially if you were to put this on like a Millennium Falcon, for example. Suddenly it's a 4/7. That is really, really tough to actually kill. And 4 power is a nice amount of power. There are options, even on some other units like your Ozatec Liberator Gunship, if it happens to not die. Even something as simple as like, well, the new green command heroism, is it Blue Squadron Wing? I think that's what it's called. But the one that's a 3/3 ambusher or 5/5 ground ambusher or a 3/3 space ambusher, and then a 5/5 ground unit, etc., etc., etc. That does look like a potential option, right? You just go turn 2, you play your Blue Squadron, turn 3, you get to go on and play Cassian with piloting, and maybe pilot something else on that and make a big one. That could definitely happen, especially since these A-Wing or the Blue Squadron can go ahead and clear the board in space, potentially on turn 2. So lots of options there, and I do think that looks pretty sweet for set 4. But I thought this was pretty funny. Before we wrap up the video, I mentioned the I mentioned the wedge the other day, and already people are like, screw you, wedge. We're on to Piet now. We want our capital ships to be cheaper. And I thought this meme was a little bit funny. We are just done with wedge already as the next day comes with the next leader, with Piet being just as cool as he is. And I cannot wait to see a Death Star I think there is a chance that this biggest unit could be the Death Star, and it could be like it could have the capital ship tag, and then we could see Piet. Maybe we'll play Death Star in the Piet deck. Like, I think that could be interesting. Like, maybe this is like 11, 12 cost unit, and it's just Death Star. Kill your opponent. Action 10 resources, kill your opponent. Something stupid. I don't know. I'm just memeing a little bit, but I just thought this meme was a little bit funny. But that's gonna be all the cards we've got today. What do you all think about Piet? I know. I don't think this is necessarily like an extremely this is gonna be god tier competitive, but I do think it is one of the most fun leaners that I have seen so far, especially since capital ships are like an underrated, utilized portion of the game. Besides like the really good ones, like obviously Ruthless Raider, obviously Avenger. Those are the two big ones. Devastator shows up as well, but capital ships are just so cool that I think Piet's going to do some cool stuff. Some commons: the TIE carrier, the resupply carrier, the fleet interdictor, any of these viable. And what about Cassian and kind of the pilots in general? I'm more inclined to believe that cheaper pilots are going to be better than the more expensive ones. So I think seeing these like 2-cost pilots makes a lot of sense. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.